Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. Fear. It's a powerful emotion that's proven to motivate people to change the way they think, act, and even how they perceive the world around them. It's no wonder, then, the public health profession employs fear as a tactic to nudge, persuade, or even bully the public into modifying its behavior. Arousing fear in order to divert behavior through the threat of impending danger or harm is called a fear appeal. And to be effective in public health, it must operate at the population level. Thus, national panics over the so-called youth vaping epidemic and related lung illnesses are born. Joining us today to discuss fear and its manifestations in the war on vaping is Dr. Raymond Niaura, Interim Chair of the Department of Epidemiology and Professor of Social and Behavioral Science at NYU College of Global Public Health. For 8 years, Dr. Niaura was the Director of Science and Training at the Schroeder Institute for Tobacco Research and Policy Studies at the Truth Initiative, where he also supervised the pre- and postdoctoral training programs. Dr. Niaura has previously taught and conducted research at Brown University, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, the Georgetown Medical Center, and the School of Public Health at University of Maryland. He was also a former president of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco and is a deputy editor of the Nicotine and Tobacco Research Journal. Dr. Niaura, thanks again for joining us on RegWatch.
Great to be here again, Brett.
As I was telling you, it's a TV term, but we have to make sure everyone knows that you're badass.
Okay, I got to put that on my CV then.
Well, that's exactly it. Well, look, we're going to jump right into this. One of the things that you guys have really carved out a solid reputation at NYU. You're, the interim chair of the department, and you've got people that are working with you that have been on our show, like Dr. David Abrams and so forth. Seems like you've got a real good team there that have carved out a reputation for harm reduction. You definitely have made a name for yourself, if you can say that, as a researcher in vaping. And I wanted to make sure that we immediately start off with the analysis that was just released this week on the 2018 National Youth Tobacco Survey in the U.S., for which the NY press release states that fears of a youth vaping epidemic may be overblown. So please do tell our audience about that.
Well, okay. Well, first of all, just thanks for the accolades. I'd like to think that we do have a really, good research group here, and in fact, it's a bunch of people, including Dave Abrams and others, who were with us when we were at the Truth Initiative. But yeah, as to the paper, so what we did was we analyzed the New York Tobacco Survey data set. Sorry, not New York, a National Youth Tobacco Survey. And New York is another survey. But anyway, there's a publicly available data set that wasn't so publicly available at first. So back in late 2018, early 2019, there was a lot of consternation about early reports from the CDC regarding youth vaping. And they put out a lot of information about this. Well, actually, they didn't put out a lot of information. They put out some information. And then they eventually got around to releasing this data set. But, by that time, a lot of the, interesting, maybe not so factual messages were already put out there by the CDC and the FDA. We got a hold of the data set, as did other researchers, and we decided, well, we need to take a closer look at things. And for example, one of the things that was missing from the CDC and the FDA presentation is when you're looking at vaping in kids, especially if you're looking at frequency of vaping, is it once a month? Is it several days a month, every day, that sort of thing? What they didn't provide us with is information about prior or current tobacco use, meaning combustible tobacco use and cigarettes in particular. So, we thought that was a pretty big omission. We went back, we looked at the information and found that, perhaps not surprisingly, that kids who were vaping, especially vaping frequently, were much more likely to be current or former cigarette smokers. So another way of saying this is that there were very, very few new vapors, meaning kids who just started vaping without using any other tobacco product. So that was illuminating, and that was the basis for the publication. Now, since then, a couple of other research groups have analyzed the same data and pretty much have come to the same conclusion.
Yeah, so when I look at Ray, and let's just for a moment here make sure we hammer home here. I've got this up from the press release. So over 80% of youth do not use any tobacco product at all?
Well, so that's the other part of it, right? I mean, when you're talking about, the entire population, most youth don't smoke, they don't vape. And again, those kids who take up vaping without prior exposure to other tobacco products, that number is just very, very small.
Right. And so it seems to me that one of the things that really caught my attention on this, and with the way that it was worded, is that this is definitely a more than just a glass half full way of looking at it. So when you look at stats, obviously you can choose to be pessimistic with the stats, even if the stats could be read very good, right? So, talking about how few people, like 80, what is it, 80, was it 86% or 84% don't vape?
Right.
Like, that's a great, how come that should be the message that everyone should be?
That's right. And again, it sort of depends on which way or which angle you want to come at this. So the way that the CDC and the FDA came at it is they declared that there's an epidemic. Okay. Right. So it's an interesting thing when government bodies declare epidemics. Usually that's confined to things like infectious diseases, at least officially. And right now we have the coronavirus scare that's going around, and at least in some parts of the world, that's a legitimate infectious disease epidemic. Sure. Well, it turns out there's no, guidelines or rules or procedures for declaring an epidemic with regard to behaviors. So, and I looked, and, it's kind of like, where's the CDC rule book that tells, people at the CDC and ergo the government to declare an epidemic? And there's nothing like that exists. So that kind of upset me a little bit, because it just doesn't seem to be, proper use of epidemiology methods, which, again, for infectious diseases, the CDC is great at. But I think they kind of dropped the ball on this one. And again, that was the motivation for going to look at the data ourselves and say, well, what kind of an epidemic is this, if it is an epidemic at all?
So there's no guidelines then. I'm going to get you to restate that for me if you could. So are there guidelines with the CDC on how to define an epidemic when it comes to behavior?
Well, no. Again, at least not to my knowledge. I couldn't find anything, and I was expecting if something occurs in the population at a certain rate within a certain time frame, et cetera, then you may, consider it an epidemic or, some kind of language like that. But there's really nothing like that out there. So, and again, it's sort of like, well, who has the authority to use these words, really? I guess the CDC does, but, again, it's one of those, somewhat mysterious things, how these things work.
So just a couple more questions, I think, on this specific topic, and let's just keep driving the bus here, careening somewhere into someplace that I'm hoping that we're going to go. So these are the stats for 2018. So let me just get our timing exactly right. I don't want to be the guy that's 2 years from now still talking about clear and present danger and epidemic and Gottlieb and lung disease and CDC deception and stuff, because that's all horrible. And I'm hoping that we move on, hopefully in a better story frame. But right now, there's so much that's unclear. And so former Commissioner Gottlieb, it was September 18th, 2018, when he made the statement that launched the entire epidemic thing. And while CDC is driving the bus on the data, it was FDA that drove the bus on epidemic. And so it was the FDA's announcement that it was epidemic, that was a clear and present danger. And at that point, in September of 2018, they don't have any data. So was it 2017 data they didn't have? No, it had to be 2018.
No, they got an early look
right.
at CDC data. That's what happened.
Right. So now this is the data.
And to your point about, who was the one that I think initially called it an epidemic, I think you're right that it was Dr. Gottlieb. And again, I don't know where in the FDA rule book it gives authority to anyone in the FDA to declare an epidemic. So they got an early look. And, so we got the data probably in March, April of 2019. So there was, quite a gap between when they saw the data and when they released it publicly. Now, the same thing's going to happen, and it's already happened with the following year's data. So we already have, an early, we don't have the data yet. We'll probably get it sometime in the spring, but the CDC has already, indicated that, past 30-day use of vaping products in youth has gone up dramatically, 20-something%. And I don't want to minimize that. So for sure, there has been some increase in uptake, but the same questions remain. Who are these kids that are using these products? Are they the current or former cigarette smokers? Do they have, other risk factors that might account for why they're using these products? One thing that came up almost by accident when we looked at the 2018 data, there was a single question in the NYTS about whether kids endorse, whether they use vaping products for to ingest, cannabis, THC. And, depending on how you slice it, over half of the kids who said that they vaped, meaning vaped anything, including nicotine, half of them also said that they had used, a vaping device to vape THC. Okay, so that's pretty illuminating, right? Because that tells us something, it gives us context. These kids are not just using, nicotine products. They're vaping THC. So interestingly, fast forward to 2019, it turns out that they removed that question from the 2019 survey. So when we get the data, again, hopefully sometime this spring, we won't be able to look at that. Now, you have to ask yourself, why did they take that question out? And, I don't have an answer to that, but
there's got to be only one answer to that. They don't want to know. They don't want to know the answer.
Well, that may be true. But all I know is that the question is no longer there. But we also know from, not just the NYTS, but from other surveys that, kind of cannabis use and vaping have, are associated in some ways. And again, this speaks to the larger issue that, there may be a small group of kids who are particularly vulnerable or prone to risk taking or whatever you want to call it. And again, not to minimize, concern about these kids. I think, that's legitimate. But it's like you said, it's sort of the glass half full or half empty question. Where do we focus? And so again, we need to kind of step back and say, ask over and over again, what's really going on at the population level? What's going on at the subpopulation level? Who are the kids who are, again, they may be vaping, but they're probably engaging in a lot of other risky behaviors.
Yeah, that is true. They seem to zero in on nicotine as a highly risky behavior when there's so many other risky behaviors that teens due to as well, because their use of cannabis is far above their use of nicotine. Their use of alcohol is far above the use of nicotine.
Right. I mean, alcohol's been a concern forever. Marijuana to a certain degree, and I think more so nowadays that it's, at least in the U.S., it's medically available. It's legal now in several states. I think that's a tide that will never be turned back. And so yeah, there's a lot going on that I think we need to pay attention to. And not to mention sort of new challenges that kids are facing with technology. And I mean, you look at rates of suicide or suicidality; those are dramatically increasing in younger populations, which is really alarming. And that seems to be kind of left out of the conversation. But we know, for example, that depression and smoking, drinking, these things tend to go together. So yeah, I think when we isolate one particular product, one particular substance, it's a very convenient thing to do, but it really misses the big picture.
So let's ask the direct question: is there an epidemic of teen vaping?
Well, I mean, I'm not authorized to say whether there is or there isn't. And like I said, I'm not sure that the FDA is authorized. I think the CDC might be authorized to say so. But I haven't seen that word bandied about as much as it was in late 2018, early 2019. So yeah, I'm hesitant to use words like that at all, just because of the point you made when you started the segment about fear and fear appeal and all of that. I mean, epidemic is a strong word. I mean, it basically is signaling to people that there is an emergency, and if there is, well, and take the example of coronavirus. I mean, in China, it's an emergency. It's not yet at that level here, but it's something that potentially is deadly. It's highly contagious, and it makes sense to think of in terms of a possible epidemic when you're talking about infectious diseases. Behaviors are not infectious diseases, though. So again, it's a lot of the language that is used, I think, is convenient. And used loosely.
Well, I agree with you there. It's loosely maybe you might be being nice there. Loosely, I think it might be actually very on purpose, right? So then it's not loosely. They're being targeted.
No, I agree. You have to kind of wonder about the motivations. I mean, why are people, using language like this? Again, it's strong language. It's strong medicine. Why are we using these terms?
Yeah, well, I've been making the point since day one, since that very day Commissioner Gottlieb used those terms, because it was three things that he said, right? He said there was an epidemic of teen use, that it posed a clear and present danger. So that's like a double whammy when it comes to fear, and actually, authorizing extraordinary action by government and authorities and public health to do something about it, because those are the highest words you can get, right? Like these are the words that are being used now about coronavirus or about other deadly outbreaks of pathogens,
right.
And they're used to quarantine. They're used to remove civil liberties, shut down airports, close down cities. That's what those terms are used for. And when the very agencies who have those powers to do that are using those terms, well, I mean, it is so reckless. It's beyond belief. I mean, it is crying wolf. I mean, it completely is. And the third thing was the line that Commissioner Gottlieb said: "We will not tolerate another generation of young people to become addicted to nicotine."
Right. Well,
And so, yeah.
yeah, and again, these are very strong terms. Clear and present danger. Wasn't that a movie?
Yes, it was.
Who was in that movie?
That Harrison Ford.
Harrison, of course, Harrison Ford. Anyway, Harrison Ford should be commissioner of the FDA. But yeah, this is, I mean, it's scary stuff. And the thing is that people really have, well, it's a little complicated. I was going to say that people have trust in government. Here in the U.S., they actually do and they don't. So people don't approve of Congress. They don't trust Congress. And I think that's all for good reasons, because politicians. But they do trust, government agencies like the FDA and the CDC. And that trust has been, pretty much well earned over decades and decades. So, this is another concern, which is if these agencies are kind of overstepping their bounds, it's really troubling to me, because again, I don't want necessarily for citizens to not trust government agencies if they're doing a good job. Politicians are a different matter. But, the government agencies are supposed to be, strong. They're supposed to be looking out for the citizenry.
I agree. Like, when you look at agencies, there's a heck of a lot of legislative power that goes into their hands, and they're not, representative of the people. So there's a trust there that needs to really be maintained. And I think that trust used to be there. Look, the bedrock of the administrative state has to be impartiality. And when the regulatory agencies no longer are acting partial, forget about even looking impartial. If they're not acting impartially, then there's a real problem, and it's that undermines trust from the public side.
Oh, I would agree, and and you see it all the time. I mean, you think about the power of the executive branch here in the United States, and that's come under a lot of scrutiny lately, for obvious reasons. And I can tell you, it's got me more and more concerned. And I think no matter which side of the fence you're on, politically speaking, you have to say, wait a second here. If a branch of the government has that much power over these agencies, which I agree should be, very impartial and to the degree possible independent, then we're in a boatload of trouble, because then everything can become politicized, and everything's about scoring political points. And I think we're seeing that play out. I think there's a congressional hearing coming up this Tuesday, as a matter of fact, where the Democrats are going to try to recreate the 1994 tobacco hearings, and they're going to try to put the vaping company executives, try to push them into a corner and get them to admit to things that they don't want to admit. But it's all politicking, it's all posturing. At this point, because there's no way that any legislation that they might want will ever be passed in this legislative season. I mean, it's just not going to happen.
So I've been a bit buried technology and all these. This is our third cast this week, so I didn't know about that. So they're trying to get the hand.
Yes,
the 9.
I swear we that nicotine is not addictive. I swear that we don't sell to kids, whatever it may be. It's a pure setup.
Unbelievable.
But it's happening on Tuesday.
So it's just complete theater. It's sickening.
Well, right. And then, again, at least, speaking for myself, this is what, distresses me about government, or one of the things. There are a lot of things. And so you have to ask, where does the common citizen play a role in this process? How do we get a voice? I'm a little bit privileged because I can be invited to testify at congressional hearings, and I can get involved in that process to some degree. But where does the ordinary citizen stand, one way or another? They have to rely on their representatives. And, this is where I think representative government in so many different ways just fails us. But that's a longer conversation.
Well, that's one I'm always willing to have. There's no doubt. It strikes me. It strikes me that we're going to move. We're going to move into the CDC, and our segue really kind of is this congressional testimony, because the last time we had you on the show was in July of 2019, and it was
right.
just 3 weeks before the lung hysteria broke out, and you were actually testifying at the congressional subcommittee hearing on Juul and the impact of nicotine addiction. Correct?
Yeah, and I think it was the day after that we had our segment. Isn't that right? So we're pretty close.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and my editing of the segment, because it was we were still doing our tapes, we hadn't gone fully live yet, so I had enough time to hold off on our edit to get a chunk of your testimony into the piece, and then we released it.
There you go. Right. So yeah, and let me tell you, that was theater writ large, and for many reasons, not the least of which is we were in a hearing room in the halls of Congress at the same time that the Mueller hearings were going on about investigation into President Trump's behaviors.
Sure.
So that was the backdrop, and then I was. It was basically the Democrats who were running the show, and the way these hearings work is they run the show, but the other side, in this case, the Republicans, have a presence, and all of the Congress people can ask questions. The witnesses, and I was one, are given an opportunity to prepare a statement. And they read their statements, and then, there's a back and forth in terms of questions. What I found to be particularly interesting is not a single Democrat asked me a question. It was only the Republicans. And now, just to remind you, I was there, to provide this, hopefully, the perspective that was kind of balanced. I think what was left out of the hearing, and the reason that I agreed to testify was, there was very little discussion about the potential benefits of vaping for cigarette smokers, and it was the recent clinical trial was published in New England Journal of Medicine, and so I put things like that into my testimony. So I was there to really advocate for the idea of harm reduction for adults. But as I said, the Democrats just ignored me outright.
Well, that's because they if they can't rip you apart, because they know that you're learned, you're prestigious, you know what you're talking about. You're representing a school that it'd be hard for them to rip apart NYU. So where do they go? They they just have nowhere to go.
I suppose. Anyway, so that was, again, it was interesting, but it was clearly just all, manipulated and set up, and it was theater, it was, public relations. Whether my testimony had, any impact whatsoever remains a mystery to me.
Well, God bless you for being there. That's all I can say. So let's move to 3 weeks later then. Describe, if you could kind of do a little bit of a narrative for me and our audience, because you are predisposed to be fair when it comes to the vaping issue. What were your first thoughts when you heard of this lung scare? Because it also broke with a full public relations campaign behind it.
Well, my first reaction was, wow, what the heck is going on? There's something clearly scary happening, and everyone, at least at first, was scrambling to figure this out. But the narrative, at least, right from the get-go, was, everybody should stay away from, any kind of vaping product, including, nicotine vapes. And then shortly thereafter, there were little, clues that came out that suggested, wait a second here, it could be, vaping products that deliver, THC in some form or other. And as information began to drip out, no pun intended, it became more and more clear, at least to me, that the focus should be narrowing on THC vaping products. And then we started to hear reports about possible adulteration of these products, et cetera, et cetera. And I think as we got more and more information, as the CDC labs themselves, as the FDA started to investigate it, to me, it just became more and more clear that it was some kind of a THC vaping product that was responsible for for these injuries and deaths. And I think last week the CDC published some more stuff. And if you look at, for example, the cases of so-called E-Valley, and I forget what that even stands for, but anyway, that were confirmed. I mean, the vast majority, 90+%, tested positive for THC, or there were the users reported that they had used THC, adulterated THC products. Now, they didn't know that they were adulterated when they used them. I think the thing that got me in particular was when I read a report, investigative report that I think was published in Leafly, and it was and again, this is my opinion, but it seemed to me to be spot on that they traced the problem to this distributor of a liquid that was used as a cutting agent to dilute the THC, and the name of the product is Honeycut. And I think the reason that they used it is because it had the desirable properties of being able to dilute the THC liquid in so that it had, people could smoke it or vape it, and then but it had a good consistency and a good color and that sort of thing. So it was easy to sell. Now it happened to contain vitamin E derivatives, vitamin E acetate, which I doubt that the purveyors of this product knew beforehand that this was going to be a problem. I really doubt it. But it turned out to be deadly, and it was it was spreading like any kind of real epidemic, where it's kind of localized geographically and then it gets spread sort of in a black market. And so the other interesting thing to me was just the epidemiology of this. When you think about, well, okay, if it's related to nicotine vaping, why is it occurring, in these pockets, geographic pockets? Why is it happening all of a sudden? Why isn't it happening in other parts of the world? Because nicotine vape, so all these indicators are telling you that it's got to be something that's very, very specific, that's temporally bound with respect to the exposures, and oh, by the way, the rates of spread of E-Valley have decreased dramatically recently, and that's probably because the Honeycut or whatever word got out. There's probably been some enforcement activity about this and so forth. So the cases have started to dwindle, which is actually a really good thing. But people are still vaping nicotine products. So if it was nicotine, we'd still be seeing, case after case coming out, and that's just not happening. So in a way, here's a classic epidemiology story where it was complete conflation of vaping these adulterated THC products with, vaping nicotine. And just look up the word conflation in the dictionary. It basically means that these two things became indistinguishable, and that's what happened. And that became the narrative, and that drove everything.
Now, the conflation, Dr. Niaura, obviously, let's just say, hypothetically, could that type of conflation happen with the world's most prestigious infectious disease agency? So prestigious, in fact, that the Chinese Communist government has allowed the CDC, or begged the CDC, or however it goes. The CDC is the ones that's doing all of the coronavirus work, not China's National Center for Disease Control that they've got. So the CDC clearly is the world's, preeminent organization. So is it possible that they could make, this kind of a mistake on, by accident?
Well, so there's two perspectives. First of all, you have to ask whether there was conflation on their part. I would argue that there was. But other people would argue, well, they were just approaching this with an abundance of caution. Beware of what you're vaping, and at least initially, you could argue, well, that makes sense. This is scary stuff, and you want to make sure that people are aware. But they didn't let up on that story up until, again, I think last week. So.
Well, and I think that's the point. I think that proves the point.
So, and the FDA actually let up on it a bit earlier than
they did a full let up on it on October 4th.
Right.
FDA made it absolutely clear on October 4th that it was THC. So that's the real issue here. Is that less than it's a month and a bit, and FDA went, whoa, we're out of this story.
Yeah, and again, we just don't know what was going on in within the CDC. Was it an abundance of caution? Was it some sort of a politically motivated set of messages? Was it just people messing up? I don't think it'll be easy to find out.
Oh no, that's the deep state. CDC is a deep state. You've got your military-industrial complex, and you've got your biomedical infectious disease complex. And CDC is not just about disease. Let's remember, they're responsible for almost every behavior stat that's out there, whether it's rape and crime and guns.
Yeah. And so this is the thing, right? Again, I think that CDC is the world's eminent, par excellence, infectious disease group, without doubt. And it may be the case that, maybe they didn't have their A team on this issue.
Oh, well, let me just stop you there for a sec. It was their Ebola team, 125 people from their Ebola team. They just got off of the Ebola fight, and they tasked their Ebola team. So when you send your Ebola team to look for something, what is a product tainted issue, if you send them for Ebola, they're from the Ebola team, they're going to find Ebola.
Well, I don't think there was any Ebola, thank goodness. But that kind of speaks to the issue of that they didn't really, know how to deal with this, and you might say, well, maybe that was a good idea on its face to bring in, the Ebola team. But, in retrospect, the Ebola people are probably not good at dealing with, issues like this. I can only hope that the CDC has kind of learned from this. But it's also, we also have to rely on the FDA, and the government agencies talk to each other. There are various levels of coordination and cooperation, and so it's not clear that was necessarily handled in the best way. Now again, hindsight's 20/20, and it's easy for us to say, well, they messed up. But
let me read this to you. So this is from behind the scenes of CDC's vaping investigation, October 25th, and this is NPR, and they had some pretty extraordinary coverage here. And let's just see here, what's the right one? Right. So, given the scope and mysterious nature of the illness, the CDC set up an incident command center to coordinate its response. In elevating an issue like this, Shushat says the CDC has directed about 140 scientists and other staff to step away from their normal work and give their full attention to the crisis. They are deploying epidemiologists, communication experts, and laboratory staff, and our disease detectives to work on this issue, which 6 months ago they were not focused on. The CDC uses this high-profile approach to take on major new outbreaks such as Zika, SARS, and the 2001 anthrax attacks. In fact, an incident team responding to the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo is still at work at CDC headquarters inhabiting the main emergency response center. And then they go on to talk about even that team is even working on it. So this is a really long story. I mean, they fully cover it.
Again, they're on the face of it, they were taking it seriously, which they should. But then you have to ask, well, why didn't they get to the, what appears to be the correct conclusion any sooner than they did?
And and honestly, to be fair, even today, it feels like they're kicking and screaming, being brought to heel. It's not like they've held a huge press conference and given out all the facts. Here's something that would be helpful if to restore some confidence with the CDC would be a full, detailed understanding of the nature of the criminal investigation that must be going on. The entire world heard about this. It impacted, continents. It, destroyed most of the vaping industry to a large extent. I mean, they destroyed the virtue of vaping, and they've driven people back to smoking. And that's all happened because some people have done some bad things with certain products. And it just seems to me that there's no criminal investigation going on. Over, 60 people have died?
Well, there may be criminal investigations going on. We don't really know. So yeah, I mean, the fallout is that, and this is the worst thing I hear, which is you have people, smokers who switch to vaping, who now out of fear are going back to smoking cigarettes. And it's like, that's going backwards. And so there's that damage that's been done and being done. And then on the on the cannabis side of things, it ought to also be a wake-up call that, something needs to happen with respect to, regulation or monitoring or quality control of cannabis products. I mean, if this sort of thing is happening in this space, is this just the first of many, of kinds of these things? It's really concerning. And then, well, whose responsibility is it to look after these things?
Yeah, no, I agree. And quite frankly, I mean, from a technology point of view, it's an effective way to deliver a substance to the bloodstream without the combustion, obviously, right? So it doesn't matter what it is. So to think that down the road that it's, the technology is going to be containable, it's just too simple.
No, I don't think the technology is at all containable. And so, again, this is my opinion, but when you have a situation like that, it seems to me the prudent thing to do would be to focus on issues like quality and safety, product standards, those sorts of things, which, any sane company would want to, adopt, because, again, it's a customer facing issue, which is, we don't, if people are responsible, they don't want to, poison their customers. I mean, they want to sell, responsible, safe, quality products. And so I it's puzzling to me why there hasn't been more of a push to kind of go in that direction. Now, I know that the FDA, Center for Tobacco Products, has been criticized along those lines. It's like, well, why haven't you focused more on quality control and so forth? And again, it seems to me that I at least I haven't heard a satisfactory answer from them. But I do think that's the way to go. In a way, it's low hanging fruit. to basically say, well, let's set up some standards. Let's set up some quality control processes that are kind of minimum and that everyone can follow, even voluntarily. And then if people want to do better than that, then they're welcome to do that.
Well, and certainly the industry would welcome that. They would, they've been self-regulating as much as they can.
Well, and
during
this
this whole process.
And this is the thing. I think the industry can also be criticized to a certain degree because it's like, well, where's the unified voice? Where are the protocols for quality control? And there are some that have been out there, have been floating around that look pretty good, but you haven't seen this cohesiveness, people coming together. But this is where a government agency like the FDA could step in and say, hey, we have a year. Let's pull together a working group and come up with product standards, and it doesn't have to be legally mandated. It could be, a voluntary coalition with the FDA leading it, saying, we can provide advice, we can bring in experts to guide this process and develop guidelines, but that hasn't happened.
It's a bit curious. You have a very precise knowledge and understanding of the lack of unity amongst kind of the industry on the standards issue. How did you come by that?
Well, I've been interested in this stuff for a long time. So, I'd go to all kinds of meetings, the Tobacco Merchants Association, GTNF, GFN, you name it. And I was, and this was, I guess you could say, the past, 5 or 6 years. And at a lot of those meetings, these issues would come up, and then you'd see little, groups start to sprout off, Caresta, et cetera, et cetera. And again, they would be doing what looks like good things, but there was no kind of central coordination going on. And I think that was the missing piece, really.
Sorry, I keep turning my mic off when I have a drink there. Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard because you've got an industry that's young, obviously, and it's filled with people who sometimes were not full business people beforehand. Created some e-juice, and a couple of years later, they've got a lot of money and a great company. And but I think ultimately in the end, it's been the complete lack of I want to use the word guidance because that's got a technical term with the FDA, but leadership. And when there has been leadership that Gottlieb brought to the table, it was one where he gave a path and a runway. And I do believe that those 5 years that he gave was designed to do that. But then that 180 turn that he did on the epidemic and everything else, I mean, that just threw everything, out of whack. So I think for the industry, I know that from our reporting and understanding is that so many of them just can't trust what it's going to be in 2 months or 6 months or whatever. So even when it comes to the PMTA process and putting the money down, even for those who have the money, which is just exorbitant amount of money, but even those that do have it, it's hard for them to make the bet because
right. And I think you could say that what's happened over the past year in particular is kind of a perfect storm. You have just a lot of fractionation. You have these, epidemics, pseudo epidemics. You have the conflation. You have the youth issue, and you have politicians and advocacy groups whose hair is on fire, constantly, and it's the perfect storm. And so I understand it. This is a tricky environment to be working in, and we're gonna have to wait and see what plays out. But May is going to roll around pretty quickly, and we're going to have to see who's left standing.
Well, we'll have to see how they enforce it. At some point here, the full civil disobedience will be everybody keeps their doors open, and
yeah, that's part of it. And then there's going to be naturally a thriving black market. depending on how draconian the regulations become. It's like you don't have to be a genius to figure that stuff out. So what's the contingency plan then for the black market? I haven't heard anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing when we're discussing it on Monday with advocate from New York, and it's just, basically it's going to shove $1 billion industry in New York straight into the same black market that's responsible for, the deaths and illnesses that were associated with THC vaping.
But one thing that I heard not too long ago, which was fascinating to me, I'm in New York City now, and so half or more of the combustible cigarettes that people buy in New York City are contraband. They're illegal. They're black market.
Yes, that's that's what we heard too as well from Andrew Osborne on Monday. Let's jump in. I want to make sure, mindful of your time, and we're going to still got a little bit more to do here. I want to go to this because I want to read some of the quotes from this guy who's fantastic. His name is Frank Faradi. That's it. Faradi. That's how you pronounce it. Frank Faradi, and he's emeritus professor of sociology at the University of Kent in the UK. He is well known for his work on sociology of fear, education, therapy culture, paranoid parenting, sociology of knowledge. Basically, this guy owns fear. I mean, like, he owns it, right? With his seminal work in 1997 called Culture of Fear. In 2005, he had another book come out called Politics of Fear. And in 2018, which is the one that I'm going to read a couple quotes from today, he released How Fear Works, Culture of Fear in the 21st Century. That came out in 2018. Didn't get a chance to put the quote up onto a slide. So I'm just going to leave this slide up so you don't need to stare at my face. Let me just read this first quote. I've just got three. We'll do one, and then let's have a chat over each, Dr. Niaura. So here it is. The transformation of people's natural anxiety about the safety of children into a cultural obsession is closely associated with the moral disorientation and mistrust that prevails in Western societies. Society has unwittingly become estranged from the values such as courage, judgment, reasoning, responsibility that are necessary for the management of fear. It was the adoption of new methods of socializing young people that served as a catalyst for the ascendancy of the culture of fear. Young people are socialized to feel fragile and overawed by uncertainty.
Wow,
And
that's good stuff. I was just vaguely familiar with this author, so now I'm actually intrigued to take a closer look at his work.
Yeah, like, I mean, it's because we all know that there's been some real troubles in Western society overall, and a complete, I'll use my language, but a complete destruction of tradition, authority, and truth, right? So the concept of truth, of course, it's so funny that the left or the progressive left will say, post-truth, and they talk about it in this kind of snide way, like they're not responsible for it, and how somehow their opponents are responsible for it, when no, you're responsible for it. So truth and knowledge have been undermined, and we talked about that a little bit in our pre-interview. And so when it just seems to be facts, and facts can be formulated and manufactured and so forth, you don't really have knowledge. You've just got narrative and fact kind of thing.
Right. Well, fear is powerful stuff. I mean, we all know that. But it's also, kind of like the genie coming out of the bottle. That how do you control it? How do you harness it? And obviously, if you're working with with a fear-based model, your motives can't necessarily be good ones. But if you look at historically how fear motivates a lot of behaviors, but how do societies that work under fear motivation, how do they manage? Well, they manage with control structures, totalitarian structures, and so forth. And in some ways, what we're seeing is, the resurgence of fear, and what you said about knowledge plays into that, because what's true anymore, and who can you trust? And I think we're in a place where we don't know where this is going to lead us in terms of our, cherished ideas about safe and just societies with structures that ensure, fairness and equity and equality and all that. I think we're in the middle of some kind of a churning, and I'm not sure where we're going to end up after it's all said and done.
Yeah, and I agree with that. It's striking to me because there seems to be, I've always known in my life, two kinds of people: the people that were for change, and the people who are against change. And I may have been on one side at one time, and I'm definitely in the other camp now. But it's not fearing change. I'm so upset about it being constructed that way, and I've always known it that way. But there seems to be one particular side of an argument, and change really seems to be at the heart of it, where they believe that change is good, all change is good, change, and keep moving forward. If you want to call that progressive, that's fine. That might sound too political, but that what it is. So how come it is that the people that are so hell-bent and obsessed with the future are also the same ones that are the biggest entrepreneurs of fear?
Well, again, fear is a motivating force, and I would have to say, again, step back. What are the motives? I can't say, but you have to ask that question. Why are people using fear as such a powerful weapon, a cudgel? Mm-hmm. And to your point about sort of the people that want things to stay the same versus those that like and want to encourage change, I think the best societies are those that have a balance of those attributes, right? And not necessarily people versus people, but within individuals. There's a little bit of a conservative part of us, there's a little bit of a liberal progressive part of us, and we kind of go back and forth between those two things, and it's the balance that's important. And I think we've gotten that part kind of out of whack, because again, it comes down to, who do you trust, who do you believe, how do you know how to trust anyone or anything anymore, given the information explosion. We're lost at sea, and again, I'm not sure where it's gonna shake out. It's hard to say. I'm hopeful that something will start to settle in, but it's hard to know what that's going to be.
So let's talk a minute about harm reduction, because harm reduction, and specifically tobacco harm reduction, it seems to be something that you would think that would be a natural go-to place for so many people. But yet, some of the strongest voices, at least within public health, in my perspective, from what I've seen, a lot of people that are, pro needle exchange and pro harm reduction when it comes to heroin and so forth, they are some of the most, anti-nicotine vaping people around.
Right, and that's kind of the part of the paradox, right, of harm reduction, because you do see, public health people as kind of being the champion of drug-related harm reduction, risky sex, other risky behaviors. And so, what, again, come back to motivation. Well, why do people understand and encourage, the harm reduction perspective for these other risky things? And, I think part of it is, respect for the individual, respect for personal autonomy, the belief that, education, and knowledge, based on science will, allow people to make, educated decisions in terms of their own, behaviors. But yet, as you noted, when it comes to tobacco, But yet, tobacco harm reduction fits perfectly within, the broader harm reduction framework. So again, it's a paradox that I think is driven by, by emotion, by these kind of forces that have nothing to do with reason or evidence or science or truth or knowledge, etc.
That's all. That's
but they're powerful, and it's really tough to figure out how do we get through this as a public health community. And this is the world that I live in, which is talking to my public health colleagues and saying, listen, we have to kind of come together on this. If you believe in harm reduction, you have to go for the whole thing. And we have to talk it through. What's the barrier? What are the problems? How do we overcome this? I think, at least again in the world that I operate in, there's dialogue and it's happening, but I don't think that's true everywhere.
No, I totally agree. And I was just grabbing something here as you were talking. This was your colleague David Abrams' piece, article from, I guess, when would it have been? I guess I'll have to grab it here. It's always good to know the date. Do you know this one?
I'm on it too.
Yeah, that's right. There you are. Absolutely. That's right. There you are. So so this is fantastic. This piece was great. We had Dr. Abrams on. This would have been October of 2018 that he came on to talk about this paper. And as we're wrapping up here, this is why I've gone into the harm reduction thing, because I want us to spend a bit of time on here, because harm reduction is risk. I mean, to talk about harm reduction, you're talking about risk reduction. And if there's problems with understanding of what risk is, which is the quotes here that I've got from Ferretti, and so why don't we just walk through this a little bit for everybody, because there's this continuum of risk, right?
Right. So let me just say more generally. So life is risk, okay, and it's unavoidable. So if risk is everywhere in various forms, then what's the response? Well, the response is to mitigate that risk, and risks are on a continuum, and risk mitigation is on a continuum. And so, the risk continuum for tobacco products, I think at this point is fairly obvious, where the combustible products are, if the smoke is inhaled, it's pretty toxic. And then you start to work backwards and, you have lower risk products. And again, I'm convinced that, especially things like certain kinds of, oral products, Swedish snus, most vaping products, if not all, are, substantially, less risky. But, it gets back to what we were talking about earlier about, product standards and quality control. We can always think about better ways of mitigating risk, and that's what harm reduction is about. But you can only mitigate risk if you know what the risk is, and if you know about ways that you can mitigate that risk. And sometimes that's specialized knowledge, but it shouldn't be specialized knowledge, because we're talking about the products that people use, in their everyday lives, in the everyday world. And that's where, knowledge and information and truth, becomes super important.
Let me ask you last final couple questions here, for sure, and then we'll let you get on with your Friday and weekend. Thank you so much for giving us the end of your week. This is a hard time always to do these kinds of things. This is an out of the blue question. Well, not out of the blue for you, not for me. How many people in the United States this year or last year, say, are going to die from smoking-related diseases?
So, I should know this off the tip of my tongue, but, we have close to 40 million smokers, and I think the The latest estimates are something close to 500,000 people die from smoking related illnesses, each year. It's in that ballpark.
Right.
And the reason is because smoking is so toxic that it affects virtually every kind of bodily system. And it's just bad stuff, and it's gonna increase heart disease and all kinds of cancers, and you name it. Probably every disease that you can think of is going to be impacted negatively in some way by smoking.
Agreed. Now the number is 480,000. Is what they have. So how many people 10 years ago died of smoking related illnesses?
I think, to the best of my knowledge, around the same estimate.
How many people died 20 years ago from smoking related illnesses?
There you have it.
It's the same number.
Okay.
It's the same number. For over, as far back as I can find in our research, it's about, I can get far enough back that I found for 30 years, that number of the number of people that are dying from smoking related disease is the same number in the United States for 30 years.
Right.
How is that possible?
It's a good question. It's not an easy exercise to put all the information together to come up with these estimates. But what I'd recommend, if you're curious, is to kind of go to some of the recent papers. I know there are some data-based papers where you can kind of go through the numbers. But what I tell people with any scientific endeavor is take a look yourself, see if you can understand it. Do the numbers make sense? You don't rely necessarily on just the scientists to tell you and convince you of these things. Nowadays, everyone can get a hold of this information. Now, you may need someone to help you interpret things or to explain things, but these are good questions.
Yeah, and I bring it up because, thank you, and the reason why, it's a tragic reason why, it's because because I first started thinking about this because public health wasn't taking tobacco harm reduction seriously. And you go, but what about the 500,000 people that are dying each year? And they're just like, whatever. And okay. And then I keep hearing that number, but I really do have to tell you, the second I saw that story on CBS in August 23rd, about the lung illness and the language they used, and they called it vaping-related lung disease. The very first time that I'd heard that, it was like national news, smoking-related diseases, vaping-related lung disease. And I went, oh my God, they're lying about this. Could they be lying about that? And that's why I went back and started going back through, and the number's not changed. So it makes me wonder about whether or not that number of smoking-related disease deaths has been politicized. That's all.
I can't speak to that, but again, I think it's fair to basically say, where do these numbers come from? I mean, I think it's undeniable that the numbers are going to be high.
Oh, sure.
And I know that they have done some recalibration over the years in terms of being able to count, what is a smoking-related illness. But yeah, I think it would be informative to kind of go back and say, well, how did they put these numbers together and so forth. And by the way, it's not just the United States. This there are estimates of worldwide deaths and so forth, and that come out of the World Health Organization and other bodies. I think it's important work, but again, it's fair game. Everyone should take a close look and try to understand where these numbers are coming from.
So lastly then, Dr. Niaura, what is next in terms of the research around vaping and harm and so forth? You guys have been knocking a few balls out of the park here. Are you going for home runs for the rest of the year?
Well, I don't know about home runs, but and it's not baseball season now anyway. So we two things. One is, we're very interested in people who are doing intervention studies, randomized trials, testing to see whether, vaping products of various sorts actually confer a benefit in terms of people quitting smoking. We are not doing a lot of that work ourselves, although for reasons that it's a long story, but other people are. So we like to keep a close eye on that. The second part is that we tend to a lot of time scrutinizing so-called observational studies, national surveys, et cetera, et cetera. And part of the reason that we take particular interest in that is that there's a lot of, shall we say, either unscrupulous science going on, or, to be more charitable, just people making honest mistakes with this stuff. And to be fair, it's hard, and it's easy to make mistakes when you're analyzing that kind of data. Anyway, we try to take a more critical eye with studies like that, and try to improve the methodology as much as we can, so that we can recover what we think is the truth that may be coming out of these studies.
Do you guys think that you have it right? Do you think you have it right compared to the others?
Of course, but you have to challenge us. If somebody thinks we don't have it right, then we need to hear about it and have a discussion and look at the data and figure it out. We can claim to be right, but we have to be able to withstand the challenge.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Niaura, thank you so much for joining us today on RegWatch. I really do appreciate it. If you could just hang tight right there, I'll just talk to you right after I do the close. But thank you very much.
All right, a pleasure.
Thank you. Well, that's it for this edition of RegWatch. Please go to support.regulatorwatch.com and see about contributing financially to our show. We obviously need your help to make this happen. And while you're online, don't forget to like us on Facebook, and please follow us on Twitter. For regulatorwatch.com, I'm Brent Stafford.